Well, I've been lucky enough to be working with communities and clammers and soft-shell clams since around 1985, and was able to help begin a project in the town of Beals in 1987 called the Beals Island Regional Shellfish Hatchery. And that hatchery produced soft-shell clams, seed clams for communities, mostly between Addison and Cutler the first few years. And that project, which was a University of Maine at Machias project, grew over the years to become something called the Down East Institute for Applied Marine Research and Education. And DEI is out there working with communities, working with individuals, working with schools, working with children, to try to learn more about our marine environment. And one of the nice things is we get a chance to do these kinds of things with clams. We can take clams and move them in various different places and different treatments and different experiments, and working with kindergartners or working with 12th graders or actually working with clammers or town officials. It's been great. One of the things that I've been frustrated by, however, over those few years, is that we have a Department of Marine Resources, and the Department of Marine Resources co-manages soft-shell clam management with towns. And it's been frustrating in that I've never really done a project in the field with anyone from the Department of Marine Resources. And I don't know whether or not that's just simply a historical gap, or whether or not it was a personal sort of thing. I don't know. But new leadership at the top has come in, and it's been wonderful working with Cole Canwitt and the area biologists, including Pete Thayer, Dennis Nault, Hannah Annis, and Heidi Layton. And last year in April we got together, we sat down in a meeting. It was the first time that I've ever been in a meeting with all the area biologists from the DMR and their boss. And that's kind of a hard pill for me to swallow, that it only happened in 2014. Nonetheless, it has, and we move on. One of the things that we decided to do was to do some collaborative work. Wow! And one of the things that the folks in the area biologist field wanted to look at was wild recruitment of clams. And so together we designed a study to take a look at both geographically and within a particular community, what might be in terms of variation in the effect of excluding predators on the clams that were already in the mud, plus those individuals that might go through their planktonic phase and settle onto the mudflats. So we designed a manipulative experiment and looked at clam recruitment and survival in 3 areas. We looked at Jonesboro, and we looked at the St. George River, and we also looked at Ruth Bay. And these were areas where we had great support from the communities to go out and set up what really is a very, very simple and very straightforward experiment, and very small scale. I would call this a pilot scale study. I put the clam landings up here to just show you that landings are certainly variable through time. And what's interesting to me is that since 1984, when the 2-inch clam law was imposed, that clam landings haven't rebounded since 1984. I just throw that out there as an interesting observation about the 2-inch clam law. I don't know if these landings have much to do with that, but you should know that here's 1984, and this is the 2-inch clam law ever since. This is before the 2-inch clam law. So at some point in time, I would like to investigate the biological implications of having a 2-inch clam law. But for right now, I just throw that out there. The kinds of things that I've seen over time is that if you throw a net out in places, sometimes you get much more than you expect. And this was the case in 2013 in Freeport, where a colleague of mine and I from Bates College were looking at growth rates of hatchery clams that were about 12 millimeters or ½ an inch in size. And we had study sites in the Freeport area, the Scarborough area, Georgetown area. as well as down east in Lubeck and Cutler and Machias Port, Beals and Jonesport. And what we found in many of those places was that the plant pots that we planted our small clams in, only 12 per pot, came back with sometimes hundreds of soft-shell clams that weren't there when we started. And so this is not just 2013 that this has happened. This has happened many, many times in terms of experiments that I've put out in various places around the coast. So using these observations, again, what we did was we set up 2 study sites in Jonesboro, 2 in the St. George River, and 2 in Booth Bay. And I don't know if these next ones are going to show very well, but in Jonesboro we had 2 sites, one up in the Chandler River or Jonesboro River called the Arthur Hill Flat, another one called Bob's Cove. In the St. George we had the Potato Patch, which helped me out here, Hannah, that's in South Thomaston, and Barney's Cove, that would be down here in St. George, yeah. And then Pete, in Pete Thayer's area, in Booth Bay, Cross River, and in Pleasant Cove. So those were the 6 study sites that we chose. And we did initial sampling. We took about 25 core samples. These are about 2-pound coffee can core samples that go down in the mud about 6 to 8 inches. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variability in terms of the number of clams per square feet that we found from these sites. I do want to show you that the 2 sites that had the highest amount of clams initially are the 2 sites that have been wormed the most. The Barney's Cove area was an area of intense worming activity, and it had initially 123.3 clams per square foot. That's a lot of clams. The Booth Bay area was pretty much depauperate with clams, not many at all, and Jonesboro varied between 2 and 17.2 clams per square foot. You can also see the sizes of the clams that we found in our core samples. We used a very small mesh to wash our samples through. It was a 1 millimeter mesh. That's 1/125th of an inch. And our design, as I said, was pretty straightforward. We had 5 controlled plots. These plots are 14 feet by 14 feet, and they just consisted of mud that at each corner we put a lath out, and there it was. It just stayed there, nothing happening in it. And then we also had our plots where we put out nets. These were nets of 1/6 inch netting. These are polypropylene black plastic nets, and we just simply, as you can see in these few slides coming up, with Heidi and Hannah, with my assistant Ben, as well as Pete here at Pleasant Cove. These are nets that have flotation on them. These flotation, they're just simple styrofoam floats that are affixed so that they will, at time of tidal inundation, they'll kind of buoy up, or that's what they're supposed to do, to not interfere with the feeding of the clams. The mud in most of the flats was soft enough so that we could just simply walk the edge of the netting into the flat. And then what we would do is simply push back the mud into the furrow so that it was essentially smooth, just kind of like a bedspread across the flat with netting. Who's that ordering? I'll have a pizza, please. Thank you very much. All right, so all of those pictures were shown between the 30th of June, the 30th of June and the 2nd of July. And I'll talk about why we started when we did and how that might affect the results. But pretty shortly after we started this study, Hannah especially noticed that in the St. George River, a lot of sediment began to build up on the nets at both of these sites. And it became worrisome. This is a shot that Heidi took to show you that just simply putting out a net, which is supposed to be exclusionary, doesn't necessarily do the job. Here's probably about a 2.5 inch carapace width green crab sitting there underneath this net. And it either was there when we started, or it somehow crawled in either through a gap in the netting or it crawled underneath the net and came up through. This is around the 1st of August in the St. George River, and you can see the nets are in trouble because they're not really doing what they're designed to do, which is to buoy up from the mudflat surface every time the tide goes in over them. And so we kind of left them alone just to see what was going to happen. And as you can see here, to the left of Hannah's hand is the net, and to the right of Hannah's hand is the mud that she scraped off of that, which meant that any clams settling onto the mudflat are not going to be protected by the netting because they can't reach the net. Why? Because when clams settle to the mudflat, they're 1/5 of a millimeter. 1/5 of a millimeter. So that means that the netting in terms of protecting wild clams in the St. George, it didn't happen. So we went out in the 27th, 28th, and 29th of October at each one of these sites to take core samples in the control areas and in the netted areas. And we took 2 cores per area. Again, these are 14 feet by 14 feet wide plots. And so that meant that we took 20 samples at each of the 6 study sites. Again, these were washed through a 1 millimeter sieve, and we took out everything that was live and we measured it. And this is what we got from the Jonesboro, one of the 2 Jonesboro study sites, and that was essentially a 25-fold increase in 0-year class, or this year's clams. You can see 14.8 clams per square feet in the control and almost 400 clams per square feet under the netting. And the sizes of the clams are shown here in the lower right. Essentially, the clams were all less than about 1/2 inch, and mostly the clams were about 1/8 of an inch and smaller. So these were very, very tiny clams. It was very tedious to pull them out and measure all of them, right, Heidi? Right, Hannah? Yes. This is what collaboration is all about. Yes. So, that was the Arthur Hill Flat. Let's take a look at what happened at the other 5 sites. Any enhancement of wild spat due to the presence of netting? No! 1 for 6. I guess we won't, that batting average isn't going to get us very far into the season, is it? In other words, you just can't simply slap a net out there and expect that you're going to get an increase in clam recruitment. You need to know a little bit more about your sites, and you need to know a little bit more about the timing. And so at one of the sites, this is the, I think the potato patch site in South Thomaston, those 123 clams per square foot, I knew were going to do really well under those nets when we put them out there on the 2nd of July. And some of them did. Some of them actually grew, and their siphons came up through that 1/6 inch net. And when we peeled the net back after we'd scraped all the mud off of it, up came a whole bunch of these clams with their siphons or their necks stuck in the aperture of the netting, which meant that when we went to core to find out, how well they survived, our sample went all to hell because we pulled out these clams. I said, "All right, Heidi, and Hannah, let's just put these in a big pile and let's see what we get." And so some of them did survive, but some of them died out because there was too much mud over the netting. So our general observations were the timing of the net. We didn't get started until the end of June, and that may have been too late in the areas in the St. George River and Booth Bay, partly because clams are spawning in maybe the 1st or 2nd week of May. So we could have missed some of the recruitment, especially in the Booth Bay area. So next, when we do this again this spring, we're going to put all the nets out by mid-May. Buoyancy, we're looking to add more styrofoam floats to them, although I'm not sure. Netting may not be appropriate in some areas. Areas that have just too much sediment in the water, they may not be an appropriate area for this kind of work. And then finally, the nets do require routine inspection. And so, you know, if a town decides to try to do stock enhancement using netting as a tool to encourage clams to settle under these nets, you saw we had a 16.677% batting average. Not too good. So you might not put a lot of effort into it early on, consider it a pilot scale study, but one thing is certain. This is something like a garden where if you throw out a squash seed and you walk away, you plant it in June and you come back in October, what do you expect to find? Well, I expect that you'd find a bunch of weeds and maybe you might find a squash that's this big. So you've got to routinely inspect and maintain these nets in order for them to play the role that they're supposed to play. And so I want to thank all of the folks that helped us in the field, as well as those that allowed us access to the flats and those that set up the study in their particular site areas for us to do the work, and Ben Ellis, the student that helped us from DEI. Okay.
We're a bit over on time, which is what always happens, and I find that in these forums that some of the most important time is the time that we have for informal conversations, but also for asking questions. So we're going to not do a part of the session that we planned a little bit later on to do some action planning around these threats. And instead, I'll encourage you over the course of the day to just take a marker that I have down here on the box and write down some of your ideas about how, through different types of collaborations, you've seen some of the models that we've been using in New England Sustainability Consortium between DEI and DMR. What are some different projects or grants or things we might be able to work on together? So those will just be up there, and feel free to jot down your ideas. There are students who are facilitating that, and they'll be circulating around. But now I'd like to invite the panelists to come back up, maybe for like 7 minutes of questions and discussion. Does that work?
Yeah, can you hit the arrow key?
Yeah.
Thank you. The funders.
Right. Product placement necessary. So panelists want to come on back up. We'll take questions from the audience and have some discussion about their science. Mike.
This is from Ryan. What is the difference, do you think, Boston area as opposed to Connecticut area? You would take for a brush in the flat.
Ryan, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah. The question was, what about brushing? A lot of towns have incorporated brushing into their management scheme. The problem so far with brushing is that there really hasn't been what I would consider a viable assessment of whether or not brushing works. Most people think, and brushing, what is brushing for those of you that this is a, so you go out and you either take spruce boughs, or you can take birch boughs or alder boughs, and you stick them in the mud. And what you're after here is to create an eddy, so that when the tide goes by this field of brush, that the water slows down. Some people think that brushing is effective as a recruitment tool because it takes clams from the water column and it catches them as they go to the bottom. Now that's an old wives' tale. What happens is that clams, like a salt shaker, clams settle from the water column onto the mud, and then the dynamics of what's happening at that microscopic layer level on top of that mud with wind and tides, they're causing these clams to be moving all over the place. So brushing is a technique that will ultimately, if clams are on the flat, it won't put them there. So you could spend, just like with nets, you could spend a lot of time wasted putting out brush for no gain, because you're expecting a settlement event to happen. If the settlement event happens, now what's going to happen is these clams are doing this on the mud flat from one tide to the next. They may land at the low, they may go up to the mid, they may go back to the low, they may go up to the high, they may go back to the mid. They're moving all over the place. Even though they want to be sedentary, ultimately they will be, but they're getting moved around by all these physical factors, and the brush is one thing that slows that water down And if those clams, which normally would have just simply gone through that area without any, any delay, now they'll hit this area of low current velocity, and they'll settle there. Okay. The problem is that once they've settled there, then what? They're not protected by anything, so they're exposed to predation. So you might get an enhancement, but you might be lucky if you do. You've got two layers of luck to go through. The first is the salt shaker, putting the clams on the flats. The second layer of luck is once they're there, that green crabs or even rock crabs or fish aren't going to use that area at high tide as a place for, oh my God, there's a meal. The nice thing about the netting is that if you put it down and you get those clams to settle and the nets don't sediment up on you, well, now you have a refuge from a lot of the predation. Not all of it, but some. So if you're going to do a brushing, just the simple fact of putting the brush out and walking away, that's not success. Success comes with, okay, it's now November. You set your project up in May while clams were spawning. Let's go back and take samples from that area and compare it to the area adjacent to it where you didn't brush at all, the control area. And if you have an enhancement over here versus over there, well then there you go. Your brushing was effective. But you have to do that sampling to understand whether or not you got the effect. And right now, I think that most towns that do this, they put the brush out and, well, it was a success because we did it.
Yes.
Brian, just to follow up to that, I'm looking at China now. And on a conservation committee the other night, we were talking about netting or brushing.
Right.
And one of the questions that one of the claimants brought up was, are there any Army Corps permits necessary, or what is that piece?
Yeah. Where's Dennis Nault when you need him? Dennis? Dennis, you're right here. We had to get Army Corps permits to put up fencing in the intertidal because it came up, 18 inches, and it was a physical barrier. We didn't get Army Corps permits. Is anyone here from the Army Corps? If you are, come tell me. We didn't get Army Corps permits to put out the netting.
There's still questions on, there are requirements under the Army Corps permitting system and getting a permit. So when we look at that, there's still a question with Army Corps on whether it's considered a enhancement or a predator control product. So you're not required to get an Army Corps permit if you're putting out brush. And it also says netting for, I think it was predator control, one or the other. So we're still having the conversation, shall we say, with the Army Corps on the exact process of how that goes about.
I read one of their permit applications that talking about permanent structure.
Yeah.
If you're brushing, it's not permanent.
There's two different types of permitting processes. There's a category 1, category 2. That's all going to get pitched out the window come September because we're going through a whole general permitting redo process with them. But we're trying to slim that down and make that easy.
So as of right now, no permit is needed for brush?
Well, for brushing, no. Technically, it's what they call self-reporting. We're trying to work through that process with Army Corps to make it easier.
Thanks, Dennis. You're always the good politician.
Is a question way in the back there?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for everything. Hey, quick question. Can we go back to Barney's for a minute down in St. George?
Yeah.
If I'm getting this right, did you do core samples there, and you found that you found big numbers where you had brought up the fact that wormers had been in there?
Yeah. In fact, Hannah was, I think, very surprised that we found a number of clams at Barney's initially because, quote, this is a place that's been hammered.
Okay, so
that's what I heard.
Okay, it's been hammered before, obviously, you started doing these experiments there.
No, it was hammered before we started doing the studies. That's right. Yeah.
Is there a conclusion that you drew, or is this something?
No, I just added that like I did the 2-inch clam law. It's just something to throw out there to make you think.
All right. Thank you.
Okay,
Although if you want, I can go back to 1997 in this same room when I presented a study that the DMR commissioned me to do along with the town of Brunswick that looked at what effect worming has on clams and what effect clamming has on clams. I won't bore you with those bloody details here, but that study's been done.
Quick question, is it worming or is it just turning the mud, do you think? Okay.
Turning the mud.
Okay.
Turning the mud.
That's it.
Hi,
And
Julie.
Brian, is that study available on your website?
Yes.
Downs Institute?
Yep.
So, last question right here.
Given what you said, and you said about the netting and brushing, did you think that furrowing might be more effective than brushing?
Roughing.
Roughing?
Yeah.
I put roughing and brushing in the same category. It's something that you can do, and you can leave the mud, and it will create those eddies as the tide comes in over them. At the end of the day, you still have what I would consider unprotected mud. And so, again, you've got to go through the 2 levels of luck to get the enhancement that you're after. You first have to get that seed that sets, and then you have to have that survival that, you know, might be problematic if you've got a bunch of green crabs running around eating those set afterwards.
Would you consider the digging being hammered by wormers to be roughing?
I would consider any digging to be roughing. And you know, some people pull clams. And you know, I'd love to do this study. When you're pulling, you're not roughing at all. You're in that very soft, soupy mud. I mean, you're not going to pull in sand. You're going to pull in nice mud. But at the end of the day, just a couple of tides later, it's as smooth as it was when you walked out there to begin with. And so, if roughing the flat is a part and parcel with enhancing recruitment, then you predict that areas that are pulled don't get the kind of recruitment that areas that are dug, whether it's wormers or clammers. So.
Okay, so we'll just hold questioning there, but you have a presentation later this afternoon too, right? So additional talk about this. And I encourage you to follow up with the other panelists as we're circling around at lunch. So thank you all for participating.